All right, like we do every week, I want to read from Exodus 19. I want to start there. So if you have your Bibles and want to open up, that's great. The scriptures will also be on the screen if you want to follow along there. Let's read the word of the Lord. Exactly 2 months after the Israelites left Egypt, they arrived in the wilderness of Sinai. After breaking camp at Rephidim, they came to the wilderness of Sinai and set up camp there at the base of Mount Sinai. Then Moses climbed the mountain to appear before God. The Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "Give these instructions to the family of Jacob. Announce it to the descendants of Israel. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians. You know how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you will obey me and keep my covenant, you will be my own special treasure from among all the peoples on earth, for all the earth belongs to me. And you will be my kingdom of priests, my holy nation. This is the message you must give to the people of Israel." So Moses returned from the mountain and called together the elders of the people and told them everything the Lord had commanded him. And all the people responded together, "We will do everything the Lord has commanded." So Moses brought the people's answer back to the Lord. Then the Lord said to Moses, "I will come to you in a thick cloud, Moses, so the people themselves can hear when I speak with you. Then they will always trust you." Moses told the Lord what the people had said. Then the Lord told Moses, "Go down and prepare the people for my arrival. Consecrate them today and tomorrow and have them wash their clothing. Be sure they are ready on the third day, for on that day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai as all the people watch. Mark off a boundary all around the mountain. Warn the people, be careful. Do not go up on the mountain or even touch its boundaries. Anyone who touches the mountain will surely be put to death. No hand may touch the person or animal that crosses the boundary. Instead, stone them or shoot them with arrows. They must be put to death. However, when the ram's horn sounds a long blast, then the people may go up on the mountain." So Moses went down to the people. He consecrated them for worship, and they washed their clothes. He told them, "Get ready for the third day, and until then, abstain from having sexual intercourse." On the morning of the third day, thunder roared and lightning flashed, and a dense cloud came down on the mountain. There was a long, loud blast from a ram's horn, and all the people trembled. Moses led them out from the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. All of Mount Sinai was covered with smoke, because the Lord had descended on it in the form of fire. The smoke billowed into the sky like smoke from a brick kiln, and the whole mountain shook violently. All right, an interesting chapter, and there is more if you wanted to continue reading. There's obviously always more that we could talk about, but I only have so much time to get through what I want to get through. So we're going to stop right there at verse 18. We're going to be traveling to Denver next month as a family. My wife's sister is getting married. It's a joyous occasion, right? It's a time to celebrate. We're looking forward to that. And I'm sure that many of you are like me, for those of you who have been married, that you can't help but whenever you attend a wedding or you're thinking about going to a wedding, what does it inevitably do? It brings up images and memories of your own wedding day, right? And sometimes those memories are really good. They're happy. They bring smiles to your face. Other times those memories can be sad. Maybe everything didn't go just like you wanted it to, right? They can be sad for other reasons as well. They don't always bring smiles to our faces, but we remember those days. I bet you remember the kind of weather that was the day that you got married, right? Whether it was sunny, maybe it was raining, maybe it was snowy, maybe it was colder than you wanted it to be, maybe it was hotter than you wanted it to be. We remember the weather from our wedding day, right? Some of you are thinking about those moments right now. We remember who was in attendance. Sometimes we can even remember who was sitting next to another person, right? You can visualize the way that people were seated in the auditorium that day. You probably remember the wacky hairstyle that you had. And you could have sworn that that hairstyle was going to stay in style for the next 20 years. But of course, you look back on your wedding pictures now and you go, what was I thinking? That's just terrible, right? Anybody else think that? I'm not alone, am I? Okay, good. Some of you are shaking your heads. You just don't want to admit it publicly. Again, some of those memories are joyful. Some of them even can be painful, but we remember them. We remember them because a covenant is a serious thing. Making promises to each other is a serious moment. We remember them because that day is marked by the covenant that you make together. Those days are important. And so the idea of covenant isn't just about that moment when you said, I do, and then they said, I do. It's not just about that. The whole day is changed as you think about that covenant, right? This is that kind of story that we're reading, that I just finished reading. It's a covenant story. It's a day the Israelites were not soon to forget. I'll guarantee you that they remembered this day for a long, long time. I'll guarantee you that they remembered by whom they were standing as they heard the word of the Lord coming from Mount Sinai. I'll guarantee you they remember how they felt as they stood there in the presence of God. They probably, too, remembered their own wacky hairstyles, right? It's something we tend to do. But that day of covenant left a lasting mark on them as individuals. Now, maybe not as lasting as we would have hoped. But the truth is, I don't think we're very far off the mark of where they were. Most of you probably also remember your day of commitment to God, your day of baptism. And yet, how quickly did you forget that day and fall right back into your old habits, your old lifestyle? It happens quickly, doesn't it? So while at one level we want to berate the Israelites, how could you not get it? You were with God. That's my same question to you. How can you not get it? You are with God, right? That's something the story teaches us. All right, well, let's talk about when God shows up. The first thing I want to say about when God shows up is that we need to pay attention. Okay, I know I've said this several times in my sermons over the last 8 or 9 months, but this is one of those duh statements, right? I mean, you get that. If I say, hey, you need to pay attention when God shows up, you're all going, why are we paying this guy? What are we doing sitting here right now if he's just going to tell us what we already know? Because sometimes you need to hear again what you already know. Because sometimes I need to be reminded of the things that I already know. Because, in case you haven't noticed, I don't have it down perfectly. I am not the perfect Christian yet. And neither are you. Even though it's an obvious statement, and even though it probably doesn't need to be said, I do think it does actually need to be said. How often do we miss the moments when God shows up? How often are we so concerned with getting what we think we deserve? Or we're so distracted by society or technology around us. We're so caught up in our own selfishness that we miss the very moments in our lives where God is on the move and doing something. All the time, we're missing those moments. We need to pay attention when God shows up. We need to pay attention in our own lives, and we need to pay attention to those moments in Scripture as well. This is one of those moments. This is one of those moments. Second thing with this is that the whole earth belongs to the Lord. Did you catch that statement in there from God? He said, the whole earth is mine. In verse 5, God declares that the whole earth belongs to Himself. And yet, He chooses this moment to reveal Himself in this way to the whole people of Israel. So, I got to wondering, why choose this moment? Why choose now? And why choose this people? Why choose this people? How are they supposed to know that the earth is God's? Just Him claiming it? Is that how they're supposed to know? Well, I want to start with that last question first. I think that they're supposed to know because of everything that they've already witnessed. Remember, He calls them back to the way that He brought them out of Egypt. And how did He do that? He rescued them from slavery by showing up, being a master over the waters of the Nile and of the Red Sea. He showed up and was a master over the skies as He sent a hailstorm over Egypt. He showed up as master over the smallest of creatures, the insects and the frogs in Egypt. He showed up as master over the large creatures, humans and cattle, as he set boils on them in Egypt. He showed up as master over light and darkness, and even over death. All of these things support the claim that God is the ruler of the earth, and that's what he's trying to show them. The question of now, why now, I think is a more difficult question to answer. I suppose the only answer that I could come up with to that question is that God needed somebody like Moses. He was waiting on somebody like Moses who would truly trust him, who would be that human catalyst and leader that he needed to do this great work. But then the question of why choose this people, I think is a really interesting one. Because if you think about it, up to this point, what about the Israelites has told you, man, he got it right. He chose the right people. I mean, what did they do the very moment they were faced with adversity after leaving Egypt? What did they say? Let's go back. Why on earth did you bring us out of there? We would have rather died there of slaves than to be free and die here. Okay, so that's not the reason. They give up too quickly. That can't be it. They're kind of like the French in that regard. They roll over. That's a history joke for those of you that like history. Just Google French and war, and then those two things don't go well together. Except for Napoleon. Okay, he's the outlier. Anyway, so it can't be because of that, right? It can't be because of that. The answer has to be because of what God has already covenanted and promised with Abraham. Remember that covenant that he made with Abraham that we talked about a couple weeks ago? The status of the Israelites, of their being the elected people of God, the chosen people of God, is not based on some intrinsic quality that they have. There's nothing inside of them that's different than that's inside of us. They don't have the image of God any more than you or I do. It's not based on that. They weren't chosen because they were special, but because God had already made the covenant with Abraham, saying that he was going to choose them. He promised to protect them and to give them a land of promise. God doesn't break his promises. God remembers his covenants. And the Israelites, even after this encounter, even after this moment at Sinai, they don't understand truly who they are and how they are the key to including all the peoples on earth in God's great plan. But by being the Lord's special treasure, that's precisely what they are. I want to talk about the idea of holiness as it shows up here in this story. What is holiness? That's kind of a big question. It's one that a lot of people think they know the answer to, but I would contend maybe it's not as clear as we've made it out to be. I think too often it's simply understood, or I would say misunderstood, as something or someone that is set apart from something or someone else. Yeah, partly, but that doesn't fully encapsulate what holiness is. I think there's actually, again, a lot of misunderstanding about this word, and it definitely does mean set apart. At least partly it means that. It does mean that as holy people, we are to be in the world, but not of the world. You've probably heard that phrase a lot throughout your life. But it does have to mean more than that. If you think back to the story of Moses meeting God at the burning bush, what does God declare about the ground upon which Moses is standing? That it is what? Holy. Is that dirt somehow set apart from the other dirt? Not really. It's dirt, right? There's nothing intrinsically holy about the dirt except what? What changes when God shows up? His presence is now uniquely in that location, right? Holiness is more than just, I'm over here, now I'm over here. I'm set apart from that before. Yes, but holiness is about the unique presence of God in a moment. In this moment on Sinai, Holiness for us as God's people means that God is uniquely in and part of who we are. And of course, as Christians, that comes through the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. God's presence is uniquely part of the things that are holy. And so holiness isn't just about set-apartness. It is about God-chosenness. That God is choosing right now to do something different. To change the physical, spiritual space of where God shows up. It's a mystery. I mean, I can't fully explain it. We were talking about the Trinity yesterday in our men's breakfast. And I just sat there going, we're just talking in circles. Because at some point we have to just admit, none of us have any clue how it works. It is the mystery of who God is. Holiness, the way that God shows up in and among us, is a mystery, but it happens. We believe that it happens. And so I think that we have to understand that by calling the ground holy, by calling ourselves holy, God declaring that this people is a holy nation for Himself, which we're going to come to more in a moment, that they're somehow changed. Something has changed about all of these things, and that is God's presence is uniquely there. So for Israel to be declared a holy nation in verse 6, it doesn't mean that Israel will be separate from other nations, at least not fully, but rather that Israel is going to be partners in this covenant, participants in the promise of what God is doing to carry out God's will. So Israel misunderstood that far too long. We need to make sure that we're not doing the same thing in misunderstanding holiness. That it simply means, well, I'm set apart from these people. No, it also means that you're part of the covenant and you have a role to play in what God is doing in this world. Being a holy nation means to be a people set apart, not simply from other nations, but for a purpose. Not from, but for. Not from, but for. And the church should function in that role. Now, turn over to 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. As we read, you probably were reminded of this verse, but I wanted to read it because it is our taking upon ourselves as Christians the mantle that the Israelites had. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, but you are not like that. You are a chosen people. You are royal priests, a holy nation, God's very own possession. Does that sound familiar? It sounds like Peter's just straight up lifting from Exodus 19, doesn't it? As a result, you can do what? You can show others the goodness of God. Notice, your being holy has nothing to do with you being apart from other people. And it has everything to do with you going back into and showing other people the goodness of God. For He called you out of the darkness into His wonderful light. All right, turn back to Exodus 19. He also declares that the Israelites are a kingdom of priests. So what on earth does this mean? Well, I think it means that the whole nation were to act as priests for everyone else in the world. What does a priest do? A priest communicates and represents holiness, right? That's what the priest in the priesthood inside of Israel was supposed to do. They communicated with God, and then they represented God's holiness to the Israelites. And what does God charge the Israelites with here? All of them, not just the priest, with being that royal priesthood to everybody. Again, a charge that's now laid upon us. So the task before us is the same. To be the holy nation, the royal priests. We are tasked with communicating God's presence and His holiness to the world. And I may do that on a weekly basis before you standing up here. But you too have that task. The moment you leave here, that's your job. It can't just be left up to me. And I'm not just saying that because I can't do it. I'm saying that because you've been charged with doing it. It is about what we do, how we represent God. You are part of that priesthood, and you are a vital member of being this holy nation. I think it's time we take that seriously. The last thing I want to talk about is covenant. I want to mention this idea again. We touched on it last week, that grace precedes the law. Far too often, I think we have a tendency to look back on the Old Testament, to see the law, and assume that the Israelites must have been really oppressed by this just heavy law that God laid on them. That is far from the truth. That is not at all how they understood the law. And in fact, I would urge you to go read Psalm 119 if that's what you think they thought of the law. Because that is the longest psalm of the Psalms. It's 170-something verses, I think. And in each and every grouping of verses, 8 verses, it is all about how the law is good. All of it. That's the whole thing that it's trying to communicate. The Israelites had no understanding that the law was oppressive, that they didn't want it. This was how they knew they were God's people. The commandments were intended to be freeing, not restraining. But it's only after God rescues His people that He gives them the covenant by giving them the law. So grace preceded the giving of the law. The law, as the Israelite side of the bargain, we know they fail at that, right? But this is what they've been tasked to do, to keep the law. Notice how this whole covenant is encapsulated. It would be interesting if we found, just through archaeological digs, if we were to find the law of the Israelites not set in the story form that we have it here. That would be really interesting. Kind of. But then it really would just be a set of rules, right? How do we have the law here, though? What is it set within? This narrative of God working with His people. They are part of the story, and they passed on the law in story form. I think there's something significant there. They didn't just view the law as sets of rules. They viewed the law as being part of God's very working with His people. The truth is that the narrative helps to show us that the law is fundamentally a gift and not a burden. The narrative keeps the personal law, the personal character, rather, of the law front and center. Unfortunately, we can often think of law as dissociated from the will of God, who is the one who gave the law. But that would be a mistake. The motivation given for obedience to the law is contained within the story. You were slaves in Egypt. That's why you obey. Well, to understand you were slaves in Egypt, what do you have to do? You have to go read that story. Otherwise, the law doesn't make sense. The law is part of the story of God. Apart from that narrative, it truly is just a set of rules. But within it, it's so much more. So the basic motivation for keeping the law isn't drawn from historical experience. It is drawn from historical experience, not from just some ethical teaching. You should do this because God said so. That's not what the text says. You should do this because God rescued you. Let me tell you the story of how God rescued you. You can imagine parents trying to impart these truths to their children, and a child asking that question, why? Why are we doing this? And the parent says, let me tell you a story. Not let me give you a rule to memorize, but let me tell you a story of our God and what He did on our behalf. I think the same is true for us. Why are you a Christ follower? Are you a Christ follower simply because God says so? Or are you a Christ follower because you've got a story to tell about a guy named Jesus who died and rose on our behalf? That's a reason for following Jesus, not just because God says so. At least for me, that's not enough. I want more. I want the story of what God is doing in the world. And the covenant we see in this story at Sinai is a specific covenant with an already existing covenant in place, right? The covenant with Abraham is already working here. This is God's fulfillment of that covenant. He's making good on the promise. And then what's interesting is that God decides to double down in this moment. Right? They've already said to God, "What are you doing with us? We don't want anything to do with you." And God says, "Okay, that's the people I'm going to put an even larger wager on. Right? I'm going to bet even bigger on them now that they've said they want nothing to do with me." What kind of God does that? Isn't that really, really weird? He makes the same bet on us each and every day. Each and every day, He makes that same bet on us. It made me think of the story of Job. The accuser shows up in God's court. He says, "God, look at your person, Job. It's only because you protected him that he trusts you and he remains faithful." And God says, "Okay, I'll take that bet. Go ahead and do your worst. And you'll stay faithful to me." God's making that bet on us each and every day. That's the kind of God that we have. A God who's betting on us, not against us, but on us and for us. And we know that because of the story of who God is. And today, in Exodus 19, we see that played out in this really neat and unique way of what God is doing in and through His covenant with His people. So to conclude, just a few questions to end with. Are your eyes and ears open for those moments where God shows up? If not, open them. Open them. Do you really believe that you are a priest in the holy nation of God's people? If you don't, change your thinking. But it's simply, just change your thinking, because you are. You are a priest. You are a priest in this holy nation. You have a role to play in representing and communicating God's holiness to everybody else. And we need to take that seriously. And then the last thing, are you upholding your part of the covenant? We know that the Israelites didn't. That's where we're going next week. We're going to talk about that next week, how they already failed God. Not long after He gives them the covenant, they choose to reject it. Sounds like us. But you know what? There's still hope in that story. It's not over. You can still reclaim and share in that covenant. So that's why we're here this morning, because none of us have it figured out. Because you're not perfect, and I'm not perfect. Because you need Jesus just as much as I do. I'm flawed, and I'm failing like you are. And that's why I'm here. Because I don't have it all figured out. And so we're going to have a time to stand and sing, where you can come and receive encouragement if that's something you need this morning. Where you can go into the waters of baptism and come up a new person, changed and fully committed to what God is doing in this world. As a church, we want to meet those needs for you. So if we can help you in any way, we want to do that as we stand and sing.